Good morning, everybody. It is Alistair, aka that pesky social worker, coming to you from the backyard. I have set myself up in front of this little gardeny area behind me, mostly because they didn't take pictures of it the other day, and I'm really proud of it. My cousin and I actually did. He did the bulk of the work. I just dug 5 holes. He put everything else in the ground. So all this nice little planting, or this side I should say, all the nice little planting you see on this side, we did. So I don't know, low key brag. I can dig a hole and put a plant in the ground. Cool. So, to get into today's video, I mentioned yesterday that I wanted to start talking about grief and sort of the anatomy of grief and what that looks like. And you can't see it off camera, but down here, I have my planner open to a couple of dictionary definitions. And this is something that I always believed in doing when I had my clinical practice when I worked with kids. For those of you that aren't familiar with a lot of my work, so most recently I was a home health and hospice social worker, which is where I'm pulling a lot of today's content and the coming days content from. But in addition to being a home health and hospice social worker, I've also done intensive outpatient, which is what they call it in New England. Down south here, we call it partial hospitalization. I was a group therapist for adolescents, typically 13, 14, up to 18. And then prior to that, I worked pediatric inpatient as part of an internship. And then before that, I did peer group facilitation at an LGBTQ plus youth center. Actually, the only one in the state of Virginia that's here in Richmond that I plan on getting actually back in touch with. That's for a later day. So we're talking about grief. And the reason I'm starting with dictionary definitions is because I want to give everybody the same launching off point. I want to make sure that we're all working with the same words because grief means different things to different people. And I think that starting with dictionary definitions and then building our way up is a really good way to start. So according to Merriam-Webster, which is my usual go-to for dictionary or dictionary.com, so there's actually there were three different explanations of what grief is, but I chose two. So the first one is a deep and poignant distress caused by or as if caused by bereavement. Now, I want you to hang on to that word. 1B was a trouble or an annoyance, like good grief, or he's giving me grief about this, or they're giving me grief about that, or my boss gave me grief about this, that, or the other. That's the other way that we typically see the word. Now, bereavement, that showed up in that first definition. What is bereavement? So bereavement is the state or fact of being bereaved or deprived of something or someone. Okay, well, what does bereaved mean? See, we got to hop down the word rabbit hole. So bereaved is suffering the death of a loved one. That's what bereavement is. So when we look at grief, which is deep and poignant distress caused by or as if caused by bereavement. Okay, so grief is the emotional distress caused by bereavement, which is the loss of someone that you love. Typically, when we see this and we use the words bereavement and grief, particularly in the hospice world, we're talking about somebody who has died. People have different preferences around the language they actually use for people dying. In the regional southern tradition, passing away is what I heard a lot growing up. People don't die, they pass away. And there are actually some people who are really okay with that and prefer that language. And then there are some people, a perfect example, I sat down with, the sister of a patient of mine who had died. And I asked the sister who had survived, how are you dealing with your sister's passing? And she looked at me and she said, my sister didn't pass anywhere. She didn't go anywhere. She died. And that was like a really confronting moment for me of like, wow, I'm choosing language that makes me feel comfortable right now instead of the other person. So if you're a clinician that's working with people who are dealing with loss, bereavement, hospice, things like that, it's never a bad thing to ask the person that you are either counseling, working with, whatever, how do you talk about this? What are the words that you want? And that's literally the question that I asked her after I got this correction of like, my sister died. And I said, okay, so how would you like me to talk about this? Would you like me to say that your sister died or your sister passed? And she said, I would like for you to say that my sister died. And people are way more receptive to that question than you think. And honestly, people see it as a sign of respect. A lot of times when we're dealing with people who are grieving, that are in that state of bereavement, we don't really know what to do because we're so wrapped up in our own feelings and our own emotions and our own discomfort around death that we're trying to make things mostly subconsciously, slightly consciously, but mostly subconsciously easier for us because we don't know how to soothe that emotional pain. And I think that that's what makes grief and bereavement really difficult to counsel and to help people through because it is so unique, and everybody experiences it in a very individual way. So going back to the definitions of the distress as if someone's like caused by bereavement, so somebody's died. So what we're looking at here essentially is grief is the form of sadness that comes from bereavement, which is loss. Um, for me, when I conceptualize these things in terms of what they look like in my personal framework, grief to me is the mourning of unavoidable, inevitable change. Because I don't think that grief and bereavement are tied exclusively to human life as we know it. I think that they are tied to lifestyles, and by that I don't mean, alternative lifestyle, traditional conservative speak. What I mean by lifestyle is, you know, think about the health crisis that we're in. Okay, think about what your life was like back in January, February, prior to March and April, and now we're into May. There is a lot of grief that is happening because people are mourning the loss of the life that they had prior to this crisis. And that's something that I'll be getting into in the next video in terms of what current manifestations of grief are. But I really wanted to start out with the basic definition. So what we have is that, grief is really the loss of, it's the emotional repercussion, usually sadness, is the root that I would put at that. And then bereavement is the actual loss of a person or a thing. Typically we think of it as a person, but sometimes, ask any 2, 3, 4-year-old that loses, their favorite stuffy or blanket or, whatever their security item is. That's a big deal. That is a loss. That is something worth mourning because that was a piece of safety and comfort and security. And oftentimes when we lose loved ones, it's a lot like losing that safety object, especially when I'm dealing with, adult parents and children are now the caretakers that are having to assist their parents throughout their dying process. That's one of the hardest things that I think I've seen people go through. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the stages of grief. If not, I'm going to touch on those later as well. But I think part of the reason why all of those stages of grief, all of those different emotions come is because in my world, I like to think of emotions a lot like colors in terms of there's primary and secondary. And by that, I mean that there are root emotions, and then capillary emotions. So there's, the big thing at the center, or an umbrella. A root emotion would be sadness. Sort of a capillary or something that falls under that umbrella would be grief, would be bereavement, because that is a type of loss, sadness. And that I definitely think falls under that root, but it's very specific. And loss is an interesting creature in and of itself emotionally, because it is the root for a lot of emotions that we would deem as primary emotions, like anger. Anger is one of the stages of grief that we'll talk about. And grief is what I call a secondary emotion. Anger is a secondary emotion. Grief is not secondary. That's definitely primary. But anger, that portion of the grieving stage, is very much a secondary emotion because the underlying is the hurt. That is what is creating the environment for, what we would deem negative, but I don't really like that word because of the connotations, because there's nothing inherently wrong with anger. It's what you do with it. Anger comes from a place of hurt, fear, loss, embarrassment, shame. Okay, so hurt, fear, loss, those happen when somebody dies. So there you've got 3 out of the 5 things it takes for, anger to sort of manifest or to plant that seed for it to bloom. And I think it's really unfair sometimes that we expect people to just get over things and we don't really honor how different the mourning process is for everybody. So today, just going back to the words, grief is just the emotional distress caused by, or as if caused by, someone's in bereavement, which means that they are mourning the loss of someone who has died. So grief and bereavement are the two words of the day. So that's where we're starting, is grief and bereavement, with understanding of what those mean. Tomorrow, I'm going to be talking more about different kinds of grief, because there are different kinds of grief. People think that grief just happens when somebody dies, and that's not true. There's anticipatory grief, there is retroactive grief, there's I'll get into all the different flavors of grief tomorrow. So that's tomorrow's video. So I hope you stick around, hang out, and check in on that tomorrow. But for today, I just wanted to get us all on the same page in terms of what we mean by the word grief, what we mean by the word bereavement, and sort of what the emotions are behind that. If anybody has any questions, comments, concerns, please reach out. Let me know. If there's follow-up questions that you would love for me to answer, drop a comment. Let me know. I will follow up, and it's also something I can address in the video tomorrow. The really awesome thing about me doing these daily is that I can have a more consistent response to what's happening. So by any means, let me know. If this is something that's very interesting to you, let me know. If you think this is super heavy right now and I should probably hold off, also reach out and let me know. As always, I super appreciate you taking the time to sit with me and listen to what I have to say. I hope that it has been helpful. I hope that everybody has a good day, and I will see you tomorrow morning. Have a good day. Bye.